I was grabbing coffee with an old friend last week, a software engineer who spent the last few years completely obsessed with digital ethics and carbon offsets. He was showing me his latest project. It was this minimalist app designed to help people radically, reduce their personal energy consumption. And he looked so proud, almost serene, talking about the beauty of doing more with less. For him, the future was all about these careful subtractions, this kind of graceful retreat into a smaller, safer world. But then I mentioned the recent moves by, the tech giants to restart decommissioned nuclear reactors just to feed the next generation of AI. I told him how we were finally moving toward a world where energy isn't some bill you have to minimize, but a raw force to be unleashed, the direct conversion of joules into intelligence. The change in him was instant. The serenity just vanished, replaced by this look of, visceral, almost physical horror. He didn't argue the economics or the physics. He just kept repeating that it was irresponsible, that we were poking the bear of entropy. He started ranting about how we need more guardrails, more oversight, and then he dropped this line that really stuck with me. He said, if we give the machines that much power, what's left for us to control? And seeing that fear, the way he recoiled from the idea of abundance like it was a threat, it made me realize something. We aren't just having a debate about technology or policy anymore. We're witnessing a fundamental split in the human species. On one side, you've got people like my friend who see the second law of thermodynamics as a cage we have to learn to live in. And on the other, there's this new, almost violent acceleration, a belief that the only moral path isn't to retreat, but capture every single joule the universe offers. That afternoon, it just became crystal clear. The era of the diesel is reaching its breaking point, and what's being called the 2026 criticality is about to force a choice that most people are still, I think, too terrified to even acknowledge. That story it cuts to the core of this deep dive. The materials we've pulled together paint a picture of this imminent global shift, this 2026 criticality. The core conflict isn't just about resource management. It's really a battle between a philosophy of constraint, the kind my friend advocates, that subtraction philosophy, and this almost overwhelming imperative of infinite abundance. So our mission today is to analyze the concrete data on energy, on computation, on space logistics. All of it points toward a future that demands acceleration, not retreat.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer philosophical weight of it all. It's not being framed as just a policy dispute. It's a struggle between, civilizational atrophy, that deliberate self-imposed limitation, and this fundamental drive to maximize energy capture. We're not just looking at spreadsheets from data centers, we're looking at the empirical data that supports this profound split, both technologically and philosophically. The proponents of this accelerationist view, they define progress by one thing: how efficiently a civilization can capture and deploy energy to fight entropy. And their conclusion is, it's unequivocal. The path the tech leaders are on now demands massive, immediate investment in new energy.
Okay, so let's start there with this new energy mandate. Joules into intelligence.
To really get it, you have to look at the philosophical underpinning. From this viewpoint, the sole moral imperative for any viable civilization is to efficiently capture and deploy energy to counter the inevitable march of entropy. The second law of thermodynamics, this moment we're in right now, is marked by this incredible convergence of the atom and the bit.
The atom and the bit.
Exactly. We've had a point where the exponential demand for computation finally mandates the total reinvigoration of the nuclear industrial base. And you can see this, maybe subtly, in executive orders and policy shifts around 2025.
That phrase, the atom finally catching the bit, it just perfectly captures the urgency, doesn't it? It explains why these multi-trillion-dollar tech companies are suddenly acting like power utilities.
They're becoming infrastructure players.
Exactly. This scramble for direct, dedicated power, it's not about convenience. It's driven by what they call the scaling law. To get that next order of magnitude in intelligence, you need a commensurate leap, not just in energy, but in power flux.
Right, and power flux is a key concept here. For anyone not familiar, think of it less as a big battery and more like a fire hose. It's about the concentration of energy delivery over a specific area or time.
Continuous maximum pressure.
Precisely. The next generation of these massive AI models needs compute clusters running at peak performance, 2047. That kind of demand is it's fundamentally incompatible with our aging, intermittent, and geographically constrained electrical grid.
And nothing illustrates this better than the story of Alana, the systems architect at a major cloud provider. Her job was to manage one of these high-altitude data centers packed with those new high-density Blackwell-class GPU clusters. And before the integrated nuclear, her entire professional life was defined by what she called the grid shackle.
Well, grid shackle, that's a great term.
She described how they were constantly planning for mandatory throttles, for brownouts, especially during peak regional demand in the summer. To meet their service agreements, they had to constantly underutilize their own hardware. They were pre-caching non-essential tasks, keeping critical operations on these noisy, dirty standby generators.
Which are not designed for that kind of sustained high-power load.
Not at all. It was a philosophy of scarcity forced onto a technology that was literally designed for infinite operation. Their cutting-edge hardware was perpetually running at maybe 60% of its potential.
And then came the shift. The moment her team synchronized their first small modular reactor, their SMR, directly to the data center.
Right. And SMRs are these smaller factory-built reactors you can deploy much faster than the old gigawatt-scale plants.
And Elena described this moment when the new, unconstrained power started flowing. She said you could almost physically feel this sense of channeling direct nuclear superabundance into those Blackwell racks.
It's like the whole system just woke up.
Yes. That's exactly her phrasing. It woke up and started achieving sustained performance levels they had only dreamed of because that fundamental physical governor, the power constraint, was finally gone.
That story just shows that the real technological leap isn't a software update. It's a physical engineering feat that needs sovereign, high-density energy. And that's why the SMR is being called the civilizational evolution accelerator.
And we are seeing this move from theory into multi-billion-dollar commitments right now.
For sure. Amazon, Google, they both announced these really aggressive plans to deploy SMRs right next to their new data center campuses.
But the most strategically significant move might be what Microsoft did in Pennsylvania. They didn't just plan new construction, they signed a 20-year power purchase agreement, a PPA with Constellation Energy to restart the 3 Mile Island Unit 1 reactor.
Which is incredible because TMI Unit 1 had been shut down just 5 years earlier.
Exactly. Restarting a large decommissioned plant like that signals a profound, multi-decade commitment to nuclear power that is being driven purely by AI demand.
And it completely dismantles the arguments from the diesel movement, right? This whole pathology of scarcity, that the only moral path is this zero-sum redistribution of dwindling resources.
Precisely. The core philosophical counter-argument is that trying to achieve economic equality by just administratively allocating less energy is a self-defeating path to poverty and stagnation for everyone.
Instead, real equality comes from
energy superabundance. If you have unlimited clean energy, you dissolve the constraint of scarcity, you make resources cheap and widely available, and you eliminate the root cause of global resource competition.
So the argument is that advocating for energy conservation in this specific context, where our computational growth is limited by power, is basically the same as arguing for intellectual atrophy.
Absolutely. From this perspective, the convergence of the atomic and the algorithmic is the essential, non-negotiable blueprint for becoming a Kardashev type of civilization. Any attempt to decouple them is seen as a direct attack on our collective cognitive bandwidth. Okay, so let's quantify why this energy mandate is so urgent. Let's dive into the physical cost of the bit, specifically for large language models. We usually focus on training. For instance, the Llama 3.1 model needed a staggering 27.51 gigawatt hours of energy just for training.
Wow. Which is what, in terms of emissions?
That resulted in about 11,390 tons of CO2 equivalent. It's huge, but it's a one-time sunk cost.
Right.
The real problem, the thing that necessitates continuous high-flux power, is inference. The ongoing act of using the model, asking questions, generating text. That can account for up to 90% of a model's total energy life cycle consumption.
90%. So that's the persistent drain that's driving the demand for SMRs.
That's it.
Okay, let's unpack the study behind this. It involved over 32,500 measurements across 155 different models. And the results show some really surprising factors driving this consumption. Let's start with content length and this asymmetry between input and output tokens.
This is where it gets really fascinating. Generating output tokens required significantly more computational heavy lifting and therefore more energy than just processing the input tokens.
Like the difference between reading a book and actually writing one.
That's a perfect analogy. Reading takes energy, but actively writing a complex novel takes far more sustained creative effort.
And we can quantify this, right? There was a specific example with the OPT30B model.
Yes. If you use a prompt that generates 900 output tokens, think of a complex task like writing a long piece of code or an essay. It consumes a shocking 11 times more energy than a prompt with 900 input tokens, but just a short output, like a summary.
11 times.
The moment the model has to activate its full generative capacity, the power spike is just dramatic, which means that as AI becomes more conversational and creative, the power draw accelerates non-linearly.
So outside of just building nuclear plants, the key to managing this is operational efficiency. The study highlights batch size as being critical. Why is running a single prompt so much less efficient than running 100 at once?
Because modern hardware, especially GPUs, is fundamentally designed for parallel processing. If you only feed it one task at a time, you're leaving most of its processing units idle while still paying the baseline power cost for the whole cluster to be on.
Right, you're paying for the whole engine to be running just to move one small part.
Exactly. The study showed that for a massive model like Llama 405B, processing a batch of 100 prompts took only about twice the time, 29.4 seconds, as running a single prompt, which took 15.4 seconds. That massive improvement in utilization just drastically lowers the energy cost per prompt. Maximizing batch size doesn't just improve throughput, it's what makes these models economically viable at scale.
You know, I always assumed that parameter count was the main driver of cost. If one model is 4 times bigger than another, shouldn't it cost 4 times as much energy to run? But the study says parameter count is an unreliable proxy.
That's a great question, and it really gets to the complexity here. If you tried to predict energy use just from the parameter count, the number of weights in the network, you'd only get an R-squared value of 0.49.
So it's basically a coin flip. It explains less than half of what's going on.
Pretty much. The architecture, the internal blueprint of the model matters far, far more. For example, the study found that model dimensionality, specifically the hidden size of the embedding layers, influences energy consumption quadratically.
Quadratically. So if you double the dimensionality, the power draw goes up by a factor of 4.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the number of layers in the network only influences consumption linearly. This detail forces developers to be incredibly clever with their internal designs.
Can you give us a concrete example?
Yeah.
Because quadratic influence is still a bit abstract.
Sure. Look at the comparison between the Gemma 2B and the OPT 2.7B models. On paper, they have a similar number of parameters. They're about the same size. But the OPT model consumed more than twice the energy of the Gemma model.
Twice the energy for the same size. Why?
Because the OPT model had a much higher hidden dimensionality and different layer configurations. Think of it this way. The parameter count is the total amount of steel in a building. The architecture is whether that steel is spread out in a low, vast warehouse or stacked vertically in a narrow skyscraper.
Okay. The structural design dictates the physical load.
Precisely. And how much power is needed to run the elevators, the ventilation, everything. Another critical detail is the self-attention mechanism, the core engine of the transformer. The original method, multi-head attention, or MHA, is a power hog.
So what's the more efficient alternative?
Newer mechanisms like group query attention, or GQA, it's much more efficient because it fundamentally shares key value pairs among several attention heads instead of calculating them all separately.
And since those key value pairs are constantly being moved around in memory, which costs energy,
sharing them dramatically reduces that redundant memory access and computation. It's a perfect example of optimizing the physics of the algorithm itself to save energy.
Okay, beyond the architecture, what about software optimizations? Everyone talks about quantization. How much does reducing the precision actually help with the energy bill?
Quantization is essential. It's the process of reducing the numerical precision, say, moving from 32-bit floating point down to 8-bit. This shrinks the memory footprint and speeds up inference because modern accelerators like the NVIDIA L4 just offer dramatically higher throughput for lower precision data.
That seems like a massive win, right?
It is, especially when memory is your bottleneck. If you're trying to cram a large model onto a single constrained GPU, quantization is absolutely crucial. But there's a caveat. If memory is already abundant, say you're running a small model on a massive, overpowered cluster, the energy savings from quantization become less substantial. In that case, you might even risk reducing the quality of your output for very little gain. It's a trade-off that depends entirely on your hardware environment.
Which brings us to hardware strategy. It sounds like just throwing the biggest cluster at a problem can actually backfire.
Massively. It's like using a dump truck to move a single bag of groceries. Running smaller models on underutilized, overpowered clusters can, ironically, lead to some of the highest energy consumption profiles.
So what about the other end of the spectrum? The truly giant models, hundreds of billions of parameters.
For those, the efficiency challenge swings right back to memory constraints. Deploying those giants across more GPUs, like running a 405B model on 16 H100s, is often necessary just to alleviate the severe memory bottlenecks, especially around something called the key value cache or KV cache.
The KV cache.
Yeah.
What exactly is that, and why does it become such an energy hog for these huge models?
The KV cache is what allows the model to remember the context of a conversation. It holds the computed vectors from previous tokens, so it doesn't have to recalculate everything with every new word. It's vital for speed.
But as the conversation gets longer?
The KV cache swells dramatically. When it gets too big to fit in the super fast memory on the GPU, the system starts thrashing, constantly moving data back and forth to slower memory layers. That high volume of data movement requires a ton of energy.
So you have to add more GPUs, not for more processing power, but just for more high-speed memory to hold the conversation.
Exactly. It's a physical accommodation for the massive cache.
This is a phenomenal amount of technical detail that, most of us never even think about when we type a prompt. How do we connect this abstract cost back to the user?
Well, the researchers who did this study didn't just publish their findings. They built a practical, citizen-facing tool, the Highly Carbon AI browser plugin.
What does it do?
It estimates the energy and CO2 usage of your individual LLM interactions on platforms like ChatGPT or Gemini, and it translates that raw energy into relatable comparisons, like telling you your query consumed the equivalent of running a light bulb for 3 minutes.
It creates a feedback loop, makes the invisible cost visible.
That's the idea. To raise awareness about the environmental cost of everyday AI. So moving from the microscopic cost of the bit to the macroscopic infrastructure needed to support it, let's look at the Logistical Roadmap. The blueprint is detailed in reports like the Idaho National Laboratory's NXUSDC report.
And the motivation here is just staggering. U.S. data center electricity demand could go from 4% of total national use today to maybe 9% by 2030.
Which requires an estimated 30 to 35 gigawatts electric of additional reliable capacity.
That's what, equivalent to powering 30 million homes? It's like building 30 massive new power plants in less than a decade. It's an astronomical ask for the current grid.
And this is precisely why nuclear is positioned as the natural solution. It's not just the volume, it's reliable baseload power, operating at over a 93% capacity factor. It's carbon-free. And a major, often overlooked factor is land use.
Right. How much more efficient is it?
Nuclear requires 360 times less land than wind and 75 times less than solar for the same output. In the competition for land near population centers, that energy density is a massive advantage.
So what are the deployment options being pursued? It's not just building new plants from scratch.
Correct. The playbook is multifaceted. You have co-location, which is siting a data center right next to an existing nuclear plant. You have restarting shutdown plants like Microsoft is doing with 3 Mile Island.
And then the new SMRs.
And crucially, the new SMRs, which can be sited directly next to the data centers they're designed to power. That creates a sovereign power source and minimizes the need for costly new transmission lines.
Data centers are famous for needing extremely high uptime. We're talking 99.99% reliability. How does the nuclear playbook guarantee that? Even nuclear plants have to refuel.
That's where modular redundancy comes in. The playbook calls for N+1 or N+2 reactor configurations. So if your data center needs 4 reactors to meet its continuous load, that's N equals 4, you build 5 or even 6 units.
So there's always a spare.
Exactly. If any single unit goes offline for refueling or maintenance, the data center's power supply is completely continuous and unaffected. It's critical redundancy for mission-critical compute.
Let's talk about the economics, because that's always the biggest hurdle for nuclear. SMRs are faster to deploy, but the initial costs must be just astronomical.
They are initially. These first-of-a-kind, or FO, costs can run up to $13,000 per kilowatt electric. That's way higher than mature energy sources.
So how do they get that down?
The entire economic thesis relies on achieving massive cost reduction as the supply chain matures. The target is to get the nth of a kind, or NOAC, the cost of the 5th, 6th, and subsequent reactors down below $4,000 per kilowatt.
That's a huge drop, more than 60%. How is that even achievable in such a short timeline?
It hinges on 2 main things. learning factors and co-siting factors. The learning factor is that classic industrial optimization curve. You see huge cost drops, sometimes over 50%, over just the first 3 or 4 plants you build in a series.
Through standardization, factory construction.
Exactly. And the other part is that it depends on the major tech players placing a huge order book, say 30 or 40 units at once. That provides the volume needed to truly industrialize the process.
Okay, beyond the reactor itself, what about the site requirements? What are the absolute critical factors for where to put these things?
Well, land, grid access, fiber optic connections, those are standard. But the 2 most critical resources are power, obviously, and water.
Water. People don't always think of that.
And it's essential. Cooling can consume up to 50% of a data center's total energy budget. Even with advanced techniques, you need a constant, efficient way to move heat away from thousands of GPUs, and that often means water. So a sustainable water source is non-negotiable.
So we have the tech, the economics. What about the government? To hit a 2026 criticality, you can't have a decade-long regulatory process.
Absolutely not. The urgency demands streamlining to get these things built and running in 6 to 7 years, ideally. The key piece of legislation here is the Advanced Act.
Yeah, what does that do?
It aims to modernize the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. It provides faster licensing for advanced reactors like SMRs and generally tries to reduce that bureaucratic time sink.
And what's the pitch to the local communities? These are huge projects. How do you get buy-in?
The benefits are framed as generational. Unlike a solar farm that provides temporary construction jobs, a nuclear plant brings high-wage, lasting employment for 40 to 80 years. This makes them really attractive for states looking to transition old industrial or coal plant sites.
And there's a local economic multiplier effect.
A big one, estimated around 1.5, meaning for every dollar of electricity produced, another 50 cents of economic activity happens in the local support industries. It's a huge boost to the local tax base and labor pool.
Okay, so we've established the physical need for nuclear and the playbook to deliver it. Now, let's pivot to the political dimension. If this immense nuclear-fueled compute power is successfully harnessed, the battle shifts from physics to control. The sources use this really inflammatory language, saying code is weaponry. How do they define that struggle?
The conflict centers on what this view terms compute sovereignty. The argument is that control over frontier computation is the ultimate political currency of the 21st century, and their core fear is the consolidation of that power in the hands of a few gatekeepers.
The ones they call the digital pope.
Exactly. The closed-source megacorporations that control the proprietary weight files and, therefore, control access to frontier AI.
So their solution is the liberation of open weights, making the models and their parameters fully public.
But why does that matter so much? I mean, isn't having responsible, closed models inherently safer? They seem to view safety measures not as protection, but as a political roadblock. That's the core of their cynicism. They analyze the AI safety doctrine and accuse it of being weaponized as a compute concession licensing scheme.
A licensing scheme.
The perspective is that the growing body of regulations around safety isn't genuinely about mitigating risk. It's about creating a bureaucratic tollgate. These high barriers to entry, expensive compliance audits, they're seen as deliberate efforts to institutionalize regulatory capture and restrict the fundamental right of independent researchers and citizens to compute freely.
It's an extreme view. They go so far as to claim that restricting compute power for something like medical research is a mandate for statistical death. We have to be clear. This is the extreme rhetoric from the source material, not our endorsement.
Of course. But it highlights the stakes as they perceive them. And we see this tension in the story of Julian, the independent researcher. He wasn't some rogue actor. He was working on complex protein folding models to discover new treatments for extremely rare diseases.
So what happened when he tried to use the established institutional systems?
He was forced to use AI systems governed by institutional safety models, and these models, which were designed to prevent the creation of harmful biological agents, just kept flagging and blocking his research.
So his search for a therapeutic protein was being mistaken for a search for a toxin.
Exactly. He was spending more time trying to trick the safety filters than actually doing science. His research was effectively paralyzed by these overcautious, pre-trained guardrails.
And how did he finally break through?
He had to abandon the sanctioned closed-source models. He switched to running open-weight models on a decentralized sovereign compute cluster. The moment the open model ran without being lobotomized by institutional filters, he described it as a moment of pure intellectual liberation. His success is now used as this powerful argument for unconstrained computation.
This goes beyond anecdotes, though. There are documented political mechanisms at play, right? The RAND report on industry influence and AI policy gets into this.
That's right. The report identifies two top influence methods used by the AI industry. First is agenda setting, steering the conversation toward problems that benefit them, like existential risk, and away from things that might invite scrutiny, like data monopolies.
And the second is just direct advocacy.
Aggressive lobbying, targeting legislators with industry-friendly language and data.
And if that regulatory capture succeeds, what's the ultimate damage to the public interest?
The concern is that it leads to policy that exclusively favors the big corporate players. So you get weak regulations that fail to protect the public, or, more insidiously, you get regulations that specifically protect market advantages by raising those barriers to entry for everyone else.
So shifting to the government's direct interest in controlling the algorithm, what are the concerns there? The House Judiciary Committee report was pretty direct.
The warning is stark. AI offers government bureaucrats the ability to mass monitor and mass censor speech at a speed and scale that was never possible before. Because AI can process and filter content instantly across billions of interactions, agencies could effectively outsource censorship to private tech companies by leveraging these models.
And what's the warning about the output quality if that happens?
The argument is that if the government interferes with training data and algorithms, the result will be what they call woke, biased, and inaccurate AI-generated results. The congressional recommendation was clear: no government involvement in private algorithm or training data decisions regarding things like misinformation or bias. Okay, so having secured the nuclear energy and defended the right to unconstrained compute, the final pivot in this framework is the ultimate goal: escaping planetary constraint through a logistical revolution.
The scale of thinking has to shift from terrestrial limits to the abundance of the entire solar system.
And this transition is defined purely by logistics. The single most critical metric is mass to orbit.
We're not talking about science projects anymore. This is about industrial throughput. The predicted performance of the Starship V3 vehicle is being framed as nothing less than a logistical revolution in space access.
It's the technological enabler for the entire accelerationist thesis. The argument is that the only metric that truly dictates the future of the species is the exponential increase in our mass-to-orbit capacity. If we stay trapped in this gravity well, all our terrestrial arguments over resources are just meaningless zero-sum games.
And there's a specific economic threshold that they claim makes Earth's resource scarcity obsolete. What is it?
The goal is to achieve a sustained, reliable cost of $10 per kilogram to low Earth orbit.
$10 a kilogram.
At that price point, the economics of orbital manufacturing and asteroid mining immediately becomes superior to terrestrial extraction. It invalidates the entire philosophical concept of Earth-based scarcity overnight.
So this demands a fundamental shift in focus, away from terrestrial resource protection and toward
high-volume orbital mining and heavy industry. Resources on Earth are only finite because the energy cost to lift mass out of the gravity well has been so prohibitively expensive. Reduce that cost to near zero, and the resources of the solar system become accessible.
And this is why any kind of planetary restriction, like FAA launch delays or environmental reviews, are framed in such severe terms.
Extremely severe. They're labeled a planetary-scale bureaucratic thrombus, a clog actively impeding the circulation of industrial throughput.
The rhetoric is just incredibly strong. They see regulatory restraint not as bad policy, but as an existential threat.
They see it as a willful sabotage of the species' future. In the most extreme terms, an act of planetary-level suicide, because it obstructs the thermodynamic imperative of expansion. The vision is unequivocal. Earth becomes a nature reserve. The solar system becomes the factory floor.
And this whole philosophical shift is captured perfectly in the story of Elias, the third-generation miner. He grew up in a town dominated by the idea of limits to growth.
His whole world was defined by the belief that he was destined to fight over dwindling terrestrial resources, to constantly manage decline. His entire mental model of wealth was based on scarcity.
But that all changed the day he watched the Starship V3 launch.
And this launch wasn't carrying a satellite. It was carrying the first wave of heavy industrial smelting equipment destined for an orbital refinery. This was bulk industrial cargo.
And his realization wasn't about the rocket science, it was about the economics.
Exactly. At $10 per kilogram for mass that used to cost thousands to lift, he saw the practical opening of an infinite universe of resources. He saw that orbital refinery not as sci-fi, but as an imminent functional competitor to his own industry.
For him, that launch meant the tangible end of scarcity. It just invalidated the entire limits to growth philosophy that had defined and constrained his life for decades. The reality of cheap, massive orbital throughput just transforms our perception of wealth. So when you synthesize all these themes, the nuclear mandate driving AI, the defense of compute sovereignty, the logistical revolution opening up space, you're really witnessing this foundational choice being forced on civilization, this 2026 criticality. It's the ultimate choice. Do you accept the self-imposed limits and the fearful subtraction advocated by the decels, or do you embrace the violent, unconstrained acceleration enabled by all this?
And the accelerationist philosophy presented here is characterized by a total rejection of the mentality of managing decline. The core emphasis is placed entirely on maximizing long-term power generation and creating infinite abundance. It views the political focus on reducing minor proximal risks and regulating terrestrial boundaries as a profound moral and intellectual distraction from the real imperative of cosmic expansion.
The conclusion drawn from all of this is that the path toward a Type I civilization requires confronting and embracing volatility. The moral path, as they define it, requires maximizing energy density and refusing to be constrained, because the ultimate lesson is that risk is the necessary input for progress.